it was almost a year ago when I started really listening to stories, much like I tell now. At this point, I hadn't even thought of starting a channel, but what I'm about to tell you may have indeed been a catalyst for the journey on which you follow me now. I remember I'd made a Facebook post just asking mutual friends if they had experienced anything paranormal or even frightening. A bunch of people commented, and there were definitely some good ones that I've still yet to tell. However, there was one particular comment from a very close family friend. A friend we will call Julie. The comment read, "When you have time, perhaps I'll tell my story. It is very frightening and 100% true." This comment stood out to me for a number of reasons. Like, I've known this woman my entire life. She is a devout Christian and very sweet. She just didn't seem like the type of person who'd be interested in this sort of topic. Moving on to a few weeks ago, I had suddenly remembered her commenting and realized she had never told me this story of hers. So I reached out and asked her if she would. She said yes, with a few conditions. I bit and asked her what they were. For starters, she said it had to be in person, and second, she recommended I just use my phone's recorder and let her speak. You know, instead of writing it down. Hindsight, I'm glad she suggested the latter, as the recording is well over an hour long. There were some details she asked me to leave out regarding family members and such. But other than using a false name, which I recommended, she said, "Tell the story exactly as I tell it." Now, before I put myself in her shoes and begin the ride, I need you all to know that most of the stories I have told you have been my own. So, I know that they are true. I can't stress enough that the tales I tell are indeed honest. And I bring this up yet again because what this close family friend had told me may be very difficult to believe, as it is one of the most demonic cases of possession I have ever heard. I must go on to say that what this friend revealed, I was not expecting. Like I've said, I've known her my entire life. Her husband is actually my father's best friend, and much like my parents, they are very matter-of-fact, down to earth, just within the lines. They have a very healthy family with good moral values. Anyway, she made it clear to me that what she was about to tell me may seem crazy, but like it or not, it happened exactly the way she says. I will add one more thing. This interview was very emotional, and I know most people take these stories with a grain of salt, but I implore you, if you believe nothing I have told you thus far, fine, but believe this, because I trust this woman with my entire life. The deep personal details, which I had not known before, Julie did not have to tell, but she did. I will do my best to retell the story as if she were speaking. I know I could never match her passion while telling it, but I will try my hardest for her. So strap in, it's going to be a long, bumpy ride. When I was a little girl, I never knew much of love. You may not see it now, but back then, I was very much a different person. I grew up in the system for the most part of my childhood. But before I was taken from my mother, I vividly remember her idea of parenting. My mother was an alcoholic and a drug addict. I was an only child, so it was just me and my mother living in Baltimore City while my mom sold her body to get by. I can still remember her standing at the door in nothing but a thong, a bra and stilettos, playing her game with whatever man was at the door. I thought she was so stunning. I also recall her introducing me to some John who had brought her a case of Pabst Blue Ribbon. That was the entrance fee. Everything else was extra. It was a very strange situation, but it was very normal to me then. My mom would go off on binges and leave me to fend for myself for weeks at a time. There was a man in my mom's life who, to me, was kinda like a father figure. But for all I know, he may have just been another paying customer. I was a little over 4 years old when social services came and took me away. And from age 4 to 9, I was in 13 different foster homes. Some were good, but some were really, really bad. I remember I would just settle in with the foster family, and the social worker would just show up one day with a black trash bag, and I just knew that it was time to go again. All of my things had to fit in that trash bag, and then it was on to the next family. It wasn't until I turned 9 that my aunt and uncle had adopted me. And for the first time, I had a family. I had 2 siblings whom I considered brother and sister. It was very gracious of them to do so, although me and my aunt would tend to butt heads. It wasn't her fault. I was a street kid. Every word out of my mouth was the F word, and I was a kleptomaniac. I stole whatever I could, but in my defense, I was in survival mode. That's all I knew. Normalcy seemed unachievable for me then. It didn't really get any better the older I got either. I struggled with self-worth. Even as a rebellious teenager, my mother was still struggling with her disease. She was in and out of rehabs while I just wanted her to come get me. I thought, out of all the people in the world, why didn't my mother want me? This unanswered question left me with very little value, so I stopped caring altogether. I started cutting people out of my life, and to those who wronged me, I got back at with a vengeance. And I wouldn't even hide it. I became very vicious and cruel. And when it came to God, I hated him. I would curse him for the life he had given me. I hated how I had all these mother figures, yet I had no mother. I had no love, and I had no faith. I was in a very dark place early on. And it was in my early teenage years that I began to really take notice to that darkness. I don't know if you're familiar with sleep paralysis, but I remember the first time that it happened. I'm going to interject here and say that when this family friend had mentioned this, I quickly acknowledged that I had too experienced episodes of sleep paralysis. Before she told me about her experience with it, she asked me what mine had felt like. I was honest, and I told Julie that the first time it happened, I was unfamiliar with it, and I had honestly thought some dark entity was responsible for it. This is when she looked at me, wide-eyed, and said, "Oh, but it is. At least, mine definitely was." She then took this moment to say to me, "I just want you to know that everything I'm about to tell you is the truth. Whether you choose to believe me or not, I'm not lying." So, let's resume with her words. I remember I was in kind of a half-sleep, and I had awoken to the feeling of something on top of me. I could feel it holding me down, and I couldn't move, and I couldn't speak, and even though I hated God for some reason, all I could do to defend myself was mentally scream for God, and it let go. It was like whatever force had me had to relinquish when I called out to Jesus. So I sat up, and everything was back to normal. Then I just shrugged it off and took it as an odd occurrence. Years passed, and I never reached back out for God again. Not until the next time, that is. It happened much later on. Perhaps I should note that my stepfather at the time was into the paranormal. He was very open to that sort of thing. I don't want to say he was a portal, but he definitely invited energy into the house. This is where the second bout of sleep paralysis took place, and this was also the most intense episode. This time, I felt those same feelings as before, and felt the pressure crawling up my body, but I also heard something. Believe me or not, but I swear to you, I heard growling. It was a deep growl, and it was coming from under my bed. I fought, but it just wouldn't let go, and then I had remembered what I had done last time. So I did the same thing. I reached out to Jesus, and then my bed hit the floor, and it was gone. I know it sounds crazy, and you may not believe it, but my bed was off the ground. It may have only been a few inches, but it slammed down, and I was free from the force restraining me once again. You'd think I'd turn my life over to Christ right then and there. However, for some reason, even after that, I refused God. But it was around age 16 that I did let one man in, and that man was Tommy. Even though we are happily married now with kids and grandkids, I definitely put Tommy through a lot. I treated him horribly. I was still very much a ruffian, and I had always been. I would break up with him all the time. I'd run around on him. But I think the reason I kept going back was he had told me that he loved me. I know it sounds ridiculous, but no one had ever told me that before. I had never heard those words before. I think that's also why I struggled with it, too. I didn't know what it was, and I didn't know how to respond to it, but he stayed by my side. So we ended up getting a place. It was a little apartment in an area that's now called Beacon Point. And at this point in my life, my biological mother had passed away, and that dream of her coming to get me never came true. But I was very happy to have Tommy, though I didn't show it a lot of the time. Paranormally speaking, not much had happened after that last bout of sleep paralysis. In fact, nothing had happened again until Tommy and I had moved into this little apartment. And when it did, it started slowly. It started with us noticing things, small things, like the sound of a door shutting or items being put in different places around the apartment. Perhaps the biggest was the way the cats would act. We had 2 cats, and at times the cats would just stare in a corner and their backs would fluff up and they'd just hiss at nothing. Sometimes they'd just be hissing at an empty hallway. It became so apparent that something was going on there that I finally got up the nerve and just called the rental office. I said, "Look, I don't care how this sounds, but something is wrong with my apartment. Did something happen here? Strange things keep happening." The woman at the rental office then said something I couldn't believe. She said, "Oh my God, you're kidding me. I'm so sorry, Julie. But the man who lived there before you, he hanged himself in that apartment. You're the first family to move in since the incident." I was in shock. She went into more detail, saying how the man tied a rope around the doorknob and tossed the rope over top the interior door and then proceeded to hang himself. The creepiest part about it all was the man's name. Coincidentally, his name was also Tommy. So all this time I'm calling my boyfriend's name. I guess I must have been enticing some spirit or something. Well, I told all my neighbors about it. I told 2 up, and I told 2 down. My good friend Sherry lived above me, and for some reason, we thought it'd be a good idea to get a Ouija board to try and communicate with this deceased tenant. We were very naive. We thought it'd be fun to try and guide it to the other side. We didn't realize what we were doing at the time. So Sherry, her husband Drew, and my friend Shauna came over one night, and we all began calling out for Tommy with a planchette in hand. Now, my boyfriend Tommy was not home. I don't recall where he was exactly, but he didn't know any of this was going on. But I do remember how excited we were that evening. The mood just seemed right. We had candles and it was dark. There was this big storm blowing in from Sparrows Point. It was exactly like you'd picture it. Anyway, we started and began asking the most obvious questions like, is there a spirit here with us? And if the spirit was in fact the ex-tenant, Tommy. Almost immediately, the planchette begins to move. Oddly though, when we asked if the spirit was Tommy, we were surprised when it said no. So we asked who it was, and while spelling out her name, it said it was Drew's aunt. Now, Sherry's husband Drew wasn't on the board. Actually, he wasn't on board, period. He was just skeptically spectating off to the side. Now, when the spirit made this claim, he was obviously more suspicious, so he suggested some questions to ask that only he and his immediate family would know. First, he asked, "Where did you work?" And the planchette spelled out, "factory," which was right. So he asked a few more questions we certainly wouldn't have known the answers to, and it was spot on every time. But then Drew threw a curveball and said my aunt was missing some fingers from the factory. How many fingers did my aunt have? The piece slid over to the number 8. Well, Drew smirked and shook his head no. Then the piece slid over one to 9, which then was correct. See, she wasn't missing fingers. She only lost one. But I knew we weren't controlling the board. None of us knew any of these answers, so I then said out loud, "You're not Drew's aunt, are you?" And like a dog with its tail between its legs, the planchette slowly slid over to no. So if you're not Tommy, and you're not Drew's aunt, then who are you? The piece then started to move back and forth on the board, spelling out the same 2 letters over and over again. A-M, A-M, A-M. We paused and thought, "Who's A-M?" we asked. And then it corrected itself. M-A, M-A. And I began to break. "Mama?" I asked, and the planchette slid to yes. Now, I began asking the board questions, and I knew I wasn't faking it. And the question answered were all correct. My friends never knew my mom. I barely knew her. But I knew the answers to what I had asked, and I was so happy. I was finally talking to my mother again. Or so I thought. Well, after that, I was so excited I ended up calling my stepsister and telling her that I spoke to Mom. "I can still speak to Mom," I told her. "Let me come over and I can show you." So I took the board over to my sister's, and again, it worked. My mother was there talking to us and answering any questions we wanted. And then we asked the big question. Together we asked, "Can you move the piece on the board without us touching it?" And the piece slid to yes. So we looked at each other and we kind of both gave each other this look like, "Are we ready for this?" And we lifted our hands and began to ask the next question. But just before the question was asked, her son busted through the door saying, "Mom, Mom," and we kind of came to our senses and put the board away. And it was after that when things began getting really bad. Really, really bad. And I felt terrible because Tommy was clueless to all this going on. He had no idea what I was getting us into. Everything I had mentioned before was happening more frequently. Items would fly off the shelf across the room. Specifically, I recall a snow globe that was on a shelf that flew off and busted. Then things even got worse between me and Tommy. We began fighting a lot. There was one fight in particular when things just really opened up. I was feeling very insecure, and I'd ended it with him for like the 12th time that year. And I remember I walked into our bedroom, and sitting on the dresser was a picture of my mother, and I pointed at it and said, "This is all your fault." And just then, it got angry. The lights went out, and then they all came back on. And then the kitchen light went out, and then it came back on, but not fully, as if it were on a dimmer. We didn't have dimmers back then. And then all the lights in the house began cutting on and off, but not at once, like one room at a time, flickering individually at their own rhythm. We had a fish tank with bubbles that came up from the bottom of the tank. Well, it just cut off. just stopped blowing bubbles. Me and Tommy just stood in fear and watched as the house took charge. It came alive. We seen one room start flickering, and then the next, and then the next, and then the lights stopped and the bubbles in the fish tank clicked back on. But the bubbles started rushing up as if the water were boiling in the tank. Then the phone started ringing. We were so scared. There was no way we were going to answer that phone. We stood as it just rang and rang. Meanwhile, the house and its lights are just going crazy. Back then, we had a landline with an old tape recording answering machine. Once the ringing stopped, we waited. We waited and listened. We had no idea what would be on the other end of that call. The machine beeped and clicked over, and then we heard it.
We're sorry. Your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please check the number and dial again.
If you've heard that before, then you know. Back then, the only way you'd hear that message is if you were calling out. It was impossible to get a call and hear that message come over. Tommy looked at me and said, "Babe, I'm getting out of here. Are you coming with me?" Well, we were still fighting. I shook my head. No, I was stubborn. So he left, and so did I. Us both going our separate ways. I began heading to my friend Shauna's house. She was the friend who initially had come over the night we first pulled out the board. So, I'm on my way to her house. And I'm crying. And I'm screaming. And I feel like I'm losing my mind. I yell at my mother, "Stop following me. You just get away from me," I said. It was then, in the car, the voices started. Have you ever driven down the street and just seen someone talking to themselves? You think, wow, they're crazy, right? Well, please, I beg you to understand this. They hear someone. They are talking to someone because I heard the voices. Now, I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was like a whisper, like a woman whispering, taunting me. I drove to Dundalk and pulled up at Shauna's house. Her and her boyfriend had just moved in. They didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, no furniture, no decor. They were just excited to have a place of their own, and here I come, busting in their door, screaming for Shauna to help. And she's listening to everything I'm saying. She's holding my hand, and I tell her everything that's just happened, and I'm crying, and she's crying. And then I get to the part when the phone rang, and all of a sudden, we are interrupted by the sound of a phone ringing from her kitchen. I freeze and I look at Shauna and see the fear wash over her. I say, "Shauna, where's your phone?" It continues to ring. "Shauna, where's your phone?" She looks at me and says, "I'm so sorry, Julie." For what? And she goes on, she says, "I'm sorry, but we don't have a phone." And just then, we heard it.
We're sorry. Your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please check the number and dial again.
I'd like to quickly interject, as this is myself speaking to you, the listener, again. I'd like to pause and take a moment and say, this part of the story was very emotional for Julie. She was crying while telling it, and I could almost see in her eyes her reliving it. She went on to say how it was at this moment she realized that whatever this was, it had attached itself to her like a parasite, feeding off her loved ones and herself. She left Shauna's that night, accepting her fate. She decided to distance herself from anyone she cared about in means to keep them safe. But what Julie didn't know was that's exactly what whatever this thing was wanted. I hope you've caught your breath because the story isn't over. So, let's finish this. That following Saturday, I had attended my brother's wedding, but opted out of being in the wedding. I just told them that I could save them money if they let me just take some pictures. Really, I just wanted to keep myself at a safe enough distance, away from all my family and friends. No one knew what I was living with, and I just figured standing in the background snapping pics here and there would be the next best thing aside from not showing up at all. Anyway, the wedding was at a church and I took a bunch of pictures, but even there, I couldn't run from it. I remember we all start piling out after the ceremony, and I guess now would be a good time to mention that my birth mother had 2 brothers, the uncle who adopted me and another by the name of John. He was the youngest of the 3. But anyway, I see my Uncle John just staring at me oddly. I mean, to be frank, he looked terrified. Well, I noticed this and I'm thinking something's wrong, so I move over to him and ask, "Uncle John, is everything okay?" And my uncle starts crying. Now I'm really worried and I say, "Uncle John, tell me what's wrong." Well, he looks up at me with tears in his eyes and says, "Julie, I saw your mother today." "I'm sorry, Uncle John, but what do you mean?" And he says, "I saw your mother. I saw my sister." I don't know what to make of this, but I ask him anyway, "Where? How?" He goes on, "I saw her here at the front. I saw her walking around. I saw her dark brown hair and her tan skin. I saw her clear as day." Something I suppose I should mention now is my mother was Latino. She had a very dark complexion, but me, on the other hand, I guess I must have gotten my pale skin and blonde hair from my biological father. But anyway, I said to him, "Uncle John, that's impossible. She's gone." And he gets this look on his face and says, "No, Julie, it gets worse." He hesitated. "When I saw her, she turned around. And it was you," he whispered. Not comprehending what he's saying, I ask, "What's that mean?" And he shakes his head and says, "I don't know what that means, but I don't like it." And he begins sobbing. Now my uncle loves his sister and would have loved to seen his sister, but without him even knowing what's going on, I guess he sensed something wasn't right with it. Things only progressively got worse after. The voices got worse. My isolation got worse. I was losing my mind. So I decided I was going to take charge. I decided I was going to take my life. I was done. I had no faith, no sanity, no hope. My life was cursed from the start anyway. I had no mom, no dad, no true family. I pushed everyone away. And even though I found Tommy, and he loved me tremendously, I just couldn't love him. There was something attached to me, like a leech, and it had finally drained me. So when the day came, I decided it would be the last day I'd live and breathe. And it was during this day that I thought I had about an hour left in me. That's all I had left in me, was 1 hour. And after that, I'd be gone too. Now, I was never religious, I've mentioned that a bunch, but if you remember, back when I was a young girl, I had those bouts of sleep paralysis. And if you recall, as a last-ditch effort, I called out to God, and the evil suppressing me relinquished. Well, I don't know if it was subconscious, but for some reason, I decided to try one last thing before I succumbed to the darkness. I went to a little church right down the road from my friend Shauna, who lived in Dundalk. The name of this little church was Water's Edge Baptist. I remember I opened the doors of the church and it was in session. I must have looked a wreck, but I didn't care. The pastor, who was up at the front speaking, stopped and just looked at me with the congregation. I ran down the aisle. All these people were staring at me, but I didn't care. I ran like a madwoman because it was just so dark. I run down the aisle with all I have left in me, and I collapse into the pastor's arms. And he catches me, crying with everyone there watching, but I didn't care. I'm broken and sobbing, and the pastor is holding me. This wasn't time for this. It wasn't time for anyone to ask for prayer. The pastor could have reprimanded me and turned me away, but he looks down at me and says to me, "Would you like to pray?" And I said, "I don't know." And he says, "What do you need?" And I said, "I don't know." And he just said, "Let's pray." He said a simple prayer. No holy water, no cinematic exorcism, a simple prayer of salvation. That's it. He finished. And I stood. I turned and faced the congregation, who was just still staring at me, but I noticed something. Something was different. I walked down the aisle, and I step outside, and I'll never forget it. I felt the sun on my cheek, and there was a slight breeze, and it was gone. It was all gone. No more voices, no more darkness. I felt like I was in a brand new world. And I thought to myself, I guess I gotta find out who this Jesus dude is. It was peaceful, so calm. There was no shaking, tongues, or snake oil. It was gentle and liberating. Before this, I stole, I slept around, I lied, I did drugs, I drank, I was hearing voices, and I was about to end it all. I committed almost every sin you can think of, and it was just gone. Needless to say, I began reading the scriptures, and it didn't take long for me to find a passage in Psalms that said, "God is the father to the fatherless." And I thought, okay, I got a dad. And later on in that same scripture it reads, "Jesus gathers all his children up under his wings like a mother hen." And I thought, okay, I got a mom. I didn't have the earthly versions, but it was okay. And then I became a mom, and I had a beautiful baby girl. But I never had a mother to teach me how to be a mom myself, so I prayed and I thought about all the things that I would love to have done as a little girl with my mom, and I took it from there. And since then, I had a son and another daughter, and now grandkids in this huge family, but they'll never know the darkness I had to walk. They'll never know the darkness my birth mother had to walk, and her mother before that. It's probably a little late to mention this, but the demonic realm had its grip on my bloodline long before my mother. My grandmother was agoraphobic. She was afraid to go outside, so she sent my mother and her brothers out on the street to get things, and I guess without guidance, my mother lost her way. And I was told by my family that my great-grandmother, who was living in Poland then, was something of a practicing witch. I mean, she actually accepted payment for charms and spells, so I was told. So evil got my mother, and her mother, and her mother. As far as before her, I'm not sure, but a multi-generational grip was held for many years by darkness. And when it came to me, statistically, I was on a path to end up just like the other women in my family. But now I have a new family, and God broke that tradition for me. God has given me new life, and me and Tommy raised a family only a block away from that church I once stepped in, broken and twisted. And we still live by that church today. I am now speaking to you directly as myself again. Most of that dialogue was verbatim, and I am very proud of Julie for speaking with me. I admire her bravery, and I can say that had she not told me any of this, I'd have never known. When I was born, she was already saved, so this came as quite a shock to me. And like I said before, her testimony was very powerful and emotional. I can't thank her enough for sharing her story with us. Now, before we conclude, I have a small mini-story that I shared with Julie before she told me all of this. It was when I was younger, and it was when I was at her home for what I can only guess was a birthday party or some celebration. The adults were in one room, and all the kids were in another. I remember a girl, a few years my elder, had suggested we have a seance. Yes, in Julie's house. Yeah, you can imagine how I felt admitting this to Julie after her story. Well, luckily she's forgiven me and her faith is strong, 'cause she didn't scold me. However, I didn't realize it until we spoke recently, but something odd did happen that day. The girl performing the seance instructed us all to hold hands, and she said some chant about spirits to the east and spirits to the west, and then asked if anyone is present, speak now. And just then, a knock at the door. We all jumped and screamed, but in came Miss Julie, just checking in on us. It makes me laugh now because I realize there was probably a higher power at work there. Only instead of darkness we saw it, it was light that intervened. And it was Julie, keeping us in check, because after that scare, we certainly did not continue. And as for Miss Julie's encounter, she was pretty adamant about not knowing what it was exactly that latched onto her. She said to me bluntly, "If you know, don't tell me." So I will keep my promise and keep my suspicions to myself. But just for those begging to know, I'll say this. I did come across something very interesting. If anyone is curious, maybe I'll give you a hint in the next episode. But for now, if you want to learn about a spirit, try looking up the Holy Spirit, because I've had enough of dark entities for the time being. So, I'm sure I speak in behalf of Julie when I say, Demon, let's not meet again.
We're sorry. Your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please check the number and dial again.